Emmett Till was only 14 when his name became a lightning rod for justice. And Carolyn Bryant was the woman whose lie would ignite one of the most infamous hate crimes in American history. What began as a summer visit turned into a brutal murder that shook the nation, exposed the rotten core of Southern racism, and sparked a civil rights reckoning that still echoes today. In the summer of 1955, the town of Mamie, Mississippi, was as ordinary as it could seem. Fields stretched endlessly under the blazing sun, and the pace of life moved as slowly as the river that ran through it. The townsfolk followed the rhythm of routine, where change was unwelcome and strangers were viewed with quiet suspicion. That August, a 14-year-old black boy named Emmett Till arrived from Chicago to visit his relatives. Raised in a northern city, Emmett had been shaped by a very different set of social rules. In Chicago, he was loud, free, and confident. Mississippi, however, demanded something else, entirely submissiveness, invisibility, and above all, silence from anyone who looked like him. Emmett's arrival caused no stir at first. He spent his days with cousins, picking cotton, exploring the woods, and marveling at the world that was so unlike the bustling city he called home. The nights were filled with laughter, stories, and the occasional trip to Bryant's Grocery, a small store run by a white couple. On one of those evenings, a decision was made that would change the course of history. Emmett, perhaps unaware of the dangerous lines he was about to cross, entered the store with a handful of other boys. What happened inside remains a puzzle woven in conflicting accounts. Some claimed he flirted with the white woman behind the counter. Others said he simply whistled. One thing was certain: in the Mississippi of 1955, even an innocent gesture could become a death sentence. Within hours, whispers began spreading. The woman, Carolyn Bryant, told her husband Roy about the encounter. In a place where racial hierarchy was rigid and ruthlessly enforced, her word carried a weight that Emmett's never could. The story escalated, exaggerated with every retelling, until it became a perceived insult to white womanhood, a deeply rooted myth that had long been used to justify racial violence in the South. Roy Bryant, along with his half-brother J.W. Millam, decided they would handle the matter themselves. For the next few days, the town fell into a tense quiet. Emmett continued his visit, unaware of the storm gathering around him. Then, in the dead of night, Roy and Millam arrived at the house where he was staying. They forced their way in and took Emmett at gunpoint, ignoring the pleas of his relatives. What followed was not a spontaneous act of rage, but a calculated execution of cruelty. They drove Emmett into the darkness, past cotton fields and empty roads, to an abandoned shed. There he was beaten beyond recognition, shot, and his lifeless body was dumped into the river, tied to a heavy cotton gin fan with barbed wire. When his mutilated body surfaced days later, it was clear that something beyond violence had occurred, was a display meant to terrorize, to silence, and to remind others of their place. The crime would stun the country, but in that moment, in that town, there was no outrage, just silence. The people of Money knew what had happened, but they also knew what was expected of them: to forget, to move on, to pretend nothing had taken place. But this time, the silence would not last. When Emmett Till's body was pulled from the Tallahatchie River, it was barely recognizable. The bloated skin, the crushed facial bones, the single bullet wound to the head, all bore witness to a level of violence that defied comprehension. It wasn't just murder, it was punishment, carried out with such fury that it seemed meant to send a message louder than any words. His great-uncle Moses Wright identified the body only through the signet ring on Emmett's finger, engraved with the initials L.T. For his father, Louis Till, even in grief, Wright understood what that ring now symbolized: the undeniable proof that the boy found in the river was his nephew, and that the crime had occurred in plain sight of the community. The state of Mississippi tried to move quickly. Emmett's body was ordered to be buried immediately, without further investigation. But Mamie Till, Emmett's mother back in Chicago, had other plans. When she received the call, her grief turned into resolve. She demanded that her son be returned home. She refused to let the horror be concealed, insisted on seeing him one last time, and then did something that changed the direction of history. She opened the casket. Thousands came to the funeral. They looked inside and saw the truth, raw and unfiltered. The images taken that day were printed in national publications, forcing America to confront what had happened to a child for simply existing in the wrong skin. As outrage began to grow, Mississippi authorities reluctantly charged Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam with kidnapping and murder. But from the start, the trial was never meant to be fair. Held in the segregated town of Sumner, Mississippi, the courtroom was packed with white townspeople, while black spectators were made to stand in the back. The all-white, all-male jury was selected with care, ensuring that not a single sympathetic ear would hear the evidence. Witnesses came forward despite threats. Moses Wright stood in the courtroom and pointed directly at the men who had taken Emmett. That single moment, a black man accusing white men in open court, was a radical act of courage in the South. The defense leaned on the familiar scripts of denial and justification. They claimed Emmett was still alive, that the body in the river wasn't his, that the story had been twisted for publicity. No amount of evidence seemed to matter. The jury deliberated for just over an hour, only that long, they later said, because they stopped for soda. The verdict was not guilty. The courtroom erupted in relief and applause. Outside, photographers captured the smiling faces of the accused and their supporters. What followed was even more chilling. Protected from further prosecution by double jeopardy, Bryant and Milam sold their confession to a magazine. They described in cold detail how they had killed Emmett, offering justifications steeped in hatred and dehumanization. They felt no remorse. For them, the crime was an act of control, a statement about the social order they intended to defend. But what they could not have predicted was how the story would grow beyond their reach. In the months following the trial, the world watched as Emmett Till, his name moved from newspaper headlines into the collective memory of a nation grappling with its conscience. The acquittal had confirmed what many already feared, that the law in the American South was a tool wielded by those in power to protect their own, regardless of the truth. Yet even as Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam walked free, believing the story would fade as so many others had, they underestimated the depth of the wound they had opened. Emmett's mother, Mamie Till, refused to let the story die. She embarked on a speaking tour across the country, recounting her son's life and the horrors of his death. She spoke not just as a grieving mother, but as a witness to a crime that demanded justice. Her voice, raw with pain and powered by purpose, pierced through the indifference of those who had turned away for too long. Images of Emmett's disfigured body, circulated by publications like Jet magazine, refused to be ignored. These were not distant tragedies, they were evidence, and they were calls to action. While some Southern politicians and community leaders dismissed the case as an isolated incident, civil rights activists saw it as a symbol of everything they were fighting against. The NAACP seized on the momentum, organizing protests, publishing reports, and demanding federal action. For many young activists, the Till case was a turning point. It showed that injustice was not just an abstract idea, had a face, a name, and a body left rotting in a river. Among those moved by the story was Rosa Parks. Later that year, when she refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama, she would say she was thinking of Emmett. His death had become more than a tragedy. It had become a catalyst. The civil rights movement, which had been building slowly and cautiously, was now lit by a fire that would not go out. Decades passed, but the story of Emmett Till did not fade. It was retold in classrooms, in protest chants, in courtroom discussions. Still, questions remained about what really happened, about the people who had stayed silent, and about the truth buried under years of fear and lies. That truth would eventually be pursued by historian Timothy B. Tyson, who began examining the Till case not just as a legal tragedy, but as a human one. His research led him to new witnesses, long-forgotten documents, and most shockingly, a confession. In a recorded interview decades later, Carolyn Bryant, the woman whose accusations had sparked the murder, admitted that the story she told was not true. Her words, quiet and belated, landed like thunder. Though legal action was no longer possible, the admission reignited demands for justice. What had been whispered for years was finally confirmed. Emmett had died not because of what he did, but because of what others wanted to believe he had done. Tyson's work didn't rewrite history, it revealed the parts left out of the official record. It gave shape to voices that had long been silenced. It brought Emmett Till's story full circle, not as a closed case, but as a living reminder of the cost of silence and the power of truth. As Timothy B. Tyson dug deeper into the history surrounding Emmett Till's murder, he encountered more than dusty records and archived photographs. He uncovered a lingering fear that had never fully disappeared. In Mississippi and beyond, many who had lived through the case remained reluctant to speak. The story had not only scarred the nation, it had paralyzed those closest to it. People who had witnessed key events had been silenced by threats or guilt. Tyson knew that to tell the full story, he would have to unravel the silence that had surrounded the truth for over half a century. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. During an interview with Carolyn Bryant in 2007, Tyson was shocked by what she quietly admitted. The story she had told in 1955 about Emmett grabbing her, threatening her, or making lewd comments was a fabrication. Her confession, nearly whispered, contradicted the testimony that had incited a brutal killing. She did not seem remorseful, only resigned. But that single moment shifted the moral weight of the case yet again. Her words were proof that the lie that had sent Emmett to his death had never been real. It was a weapon of convenience used in a society where such accusations didn't need to be true to be deadly. Tyson didn't stop there. He tracked down family members, court officials, and law enforcement connected to the original investigation. In doing so, he discovered long-lost trial transcripts, letters, and photos. He learned of jurors who had admitted privately that they knew the defendants were guilty. He read accounts of townspeople who had seen Emmett in the custody of Bryant and Millam, who had chosen to stay quiet out of fear for their lives. Some had tried to forget. Others had never forgiven themselves. The documents painted a fuller, more chilling picture. Officials had suppressed evidence. Investigators had ignored leads. Community members had colluded to obstruct justice. Emmett's murder was indeed just a crime committed by two men. It was an act enabled by an entire system designed to protect whiteness and punish dissent. The truth had been buried deliberately, piece by piece, behind smiles, handshakes, and court procedures. The justice system had not failed. It had functioned exactly as it was intended to. What Tyson's research revealed was that Emmett's murder had never ended with the trial. The true crime wasn't just what happened on that dark night, it was the decades of silence, the decades of knowing, and the refusal to face what had really occurred. Each layer Tyson uncovered pointed to a deeper conspiracy, not written in formal agreements, but etched into the cultural code of the time. The lie told by Carolyn Bryant had only been the first. The greater crime was the complicity of a society that looked away and allowed two known murderers to walk free. As the evidence mounted, Tyson's findings reignited a national conversation. Books, documentaries, and museum exhibits began to reflect these new truths. What had once been thought of as a closed chapter in civil rights history was now a living, breathing testimony to a justice denied. The story was no longer about two killers, it was about everyone who let them get away with it. The story of Emmett Till did not end in the courtroom or in the quiet corners of history where so many tried to leave it. Instead, it continued to evolve, taking on a life of its own, a legacy shaped by memory, activism, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Decades after his death, Emmett became more than a victim. He became a symbol, one that transcended time and geography. His name echoed through marches, courtrooms, classrooms, and congressional halls. His story, painful and unresolved, remained a mirror held up to the soul of America. As generations passed, the stain of his murder remained fresh in the minds of those who understood what it represented. For every advance in civil rights, there was a reminder that the work remained unfinished. The story of Emmett Till resurfaced each time a new name was added to the long list of black lives lost to racial violence. From Rodney King to Trayvon Martin, from George Floyd to countless others, the image of Emmett's mutilated face continued to haunt the national conscience. The past, as Tyson's work reminded the world, was never really past. In 2016, a sign marking the spot where Emmett's body was found in the Tallahatchie River was riddled with bullet holes, vandalized not once, but repeatedly. These acts weren't random. They were messages from those still unwilling to face the truth, still desperate to silence a boy who had already been silenced in life. But each time the sign was destroyed, it was replaced, stronger and more resilient. The act of remembrance itself became a form of resistance. Tyson's book, The Blood of Emmett Till, did more than re-examine a historical crime. It forced the country to confront the systems of injustice that remained alive. His revelations sparked national debates, reopened investigative files, and led to official recognition by the Department of Justice. While no further charges were ultimately filed, the acknowledgement of truth became its own form of justice. In 2022, the U.S. government signed into law the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, officially recognizing lynching as a federal hate crime, something long overdue but deeply symbolic. Memorials were built. Streets were renamed. Emmett's story was taught in schools where it had once been ignored. His mother, Mamie Till, who had fought so hard to make the world see her son, was posthumously honored for her courage and vision. The world began to understand that this was never just one story, but a reflection of many. Emmett represented every life devalued, every truth denied, every justice delayed. The legacy of Emmett Till is not sealed in the past. It lives on in activism, in art, in law, and in memory. His story, once buried beneath silence and fear, now stands as a challenger reminder of what happens when truth is ignored, and what's possible when it is faced. The blood of Emmett Till, spilled so cruelly, did not fade into the soil. It soaked into the roots of a movement still growing, still fighting, and still demanding to be heard.